Hello, welcome back to the Hindustan Times podcast. I'm your host, Shashank Mattoo, reporting to you from Washington, D.C. For the last few months, India has been watching closely as the relationship between Pakistan and the United States has improved sharply. We've seen Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Field Marshal Asim Munir visit the United States several times. There's talk of critical minerals cooperation, high level defense talks, and for those of you who are paying attention, Pakistan also featured very prominently in Donald Trump's peace plans for the Middle East. So, what exactly is going on here? Is this a tactical improvement in relations, or is something deeper going on here? I'm joined today by Uzair Younus, who is principal at the Asia Group and a close analyst of Pakistan as well as its relationship the United States. Mr. Younus, you think that there is actually something deeper going on here in terms of the improvement in the relationship between the United States and Pakistan? You're saying that America is subtly shifting its policy on Pakistan after years of neglect, and that shift could actually cause long-term tensions with India. So, what do you think is going on?
So I think, thanks for having me. I think what's happening is that Pakistan is firmly becoming entrenched in the United States' West Asia or Middle East plans and security architecture in particular at a level that perhaps has not been there for a number of years now. And this is a change because post the exit from Afghanistan, there was this question mark about where Pakistan fit in. It didn't really fit into the United States' Indo Pacific strategy. There was a lot of, particularly in the Biden administration, a lot of angst about Pakistan's role in Afghanistan and what had transpired as the United States exited Kabul. And I think in the second Trump administration, a new framework has been developed between the two countries that rests, in my view, on three pillars. First and foremost, this idea of a new regional security architecture in the Middle East, led by Saudi Arabia, with which Pakistan signed a strategic defense agreement recently as well. And then the Gaza peace plan is part of that entire architecture as well. The second pillar is critical minerals, which you alluded to as well, as it relates to the United States is viewed that wherever in the world there are critical mineral assets that are undeveloped or underdeveloped, there the United States will compete with China and make sure that China does not win out by default in these places. So Pakistan is front and center over there as well. And then finally, the old counter-terror cooperation lens, where Afghanistan in particular has once again emerged as a hotbed of terrorism, a bunch of franchises operating, in particular targeting still the United States and Western allies. There is a role for Pakistan. So these three sort of legs are the stool in which a new relationship currently is being developed.
Right. I could be ask you a little bit about what's happened over the last couple of years, because for a lot of Indians who were tracking this story, it really seemed like during the Biden administration, Pakistan was really very much on the back burner for the Biden administration. They, in fact, came out publicly. I think Wendy Sherman, the Deputy Secretary of State, came to India and said very frankly that we're not looking to do all that much with Pakistan in our relationship. That was a fairly extraordinary statement to make. And when the Trump administration came in, I think who were following the Pakistan US story felt that, in fact, the Trump administration would be even harder on Pakistan. But things have changed. And you've actually made this argument that you feel that many in India have also made, that Pakistan has actually played its cards well with the Trump administration. What do you think they've got right?
So I think it definitely was motivated prior to Donald Trump entering the White House in January. There were two fears that were very high on the radar, so to speak, in both Rawalpindi and Islamabad. The first fear was that the president may pay attention or may pay more attention to diaspora voices in the United States who had been agitating on behalf of Imran Khan, who remains in prison. And case in point of that were the tweets that Richard Grenell, for example, started putting out post November about Mr. Khan and his future in Pakistan. The second fear that the Pakistanis had was that as the Trump administration moved forward on a new roadmap for Gaza and the expansion of the Abraham Accords, they did not want to be on the wrong side of this. And the Pakistanis sort of paid very close attention to the debates and the conversations within the MAGA ecosystem on these two topics and realized that they had to offer things of value to the United States that would make the president and his inner circle reconsider or look at the Pakistani value offering, so to speak. So on the offering side, it began with the Abbey Gate operation, something that the president himself thanked Pakistan on in February during his State of the Union address here in Washington.
Right.
There were other cooperation in terms of looking at ISIS Khorasan and its operations. On Iran, some level of conversations had been ongoing for a number of months, culminating famously with that lunch on the eve of the Iranian strikes on Iran's nuclear program. And then on the Middle East plan, the approach largely was that allowing Saudi Arabia in particular to take the lead as the regional leader on this issue, to engage with the president, but then offer Pakistani support in whatever way it was necessary, led by the Arab allies. And I think that approach was taken positively by the Trump administration. And it was in part this fear that we don't want to rock the boat too much once more and go further down this hole where both a domestic political issue gets developed, but also internationally, Pakistan stares down with the United States. That was part of the way in which the Pakistanis recalibrated their strategy and began to offer things very early on that matter to the United States, but in particular also matter to the priorities of the president as well.
Right. Mr. Yunus, could we have this conversation about, before we get into the three pillars that you've talked about, in terms of how Pakistan has made those overtures? Because sitting here, or at least from an Indian perspective, there's been very clearly this assertion that corruption has been involved in some cases. Those links between, the Pakistan Crypto Council and key members of the Trump family have played out. And of course, this is not new with what we're seeing with Qatar, for example, offering a jet to the Trump administration, to President Trump. There very much seems to be this idea that influence can be bought with the Trump administration in a fairly brazen way. And the sense is, among lots of people, in fact, the former US ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, also said this, that in fact, there does seem to be this idea that Pakistan has also purchased influence with the Trump administration. How correct do you think that criticism is?
I find it laughable at best, Shashank. And the reason for that is, um, on one hand, Indian interlocutors, influencers, media says Pakistan is a bankrupt country that has no access to financing. On the second hand, the allegation is made that somehow Pakistan has used corrupt influences to, via crypto or something else, to buy influence inside the administration. It's preposterous and it's laughable, and it's inconsistent, because both those things cannot be true at the same time. The second thing I would point out is that when you look at the early engagements that were there post January inauguration, um, a lot of Indian elite business leaders were engaging with the inner circle of Donald Trump, his family, and the MAGA ecosystem. So, if Pakistan, with bankrupt, lack of access to financing, can somehow magically, buy influence, then one must ask what Indian business leaders who have wealth in excess of Pakistan's total foreign exchange reserves were doing, and questions should be asked about why weren't they smart enough in that same way, right? So I find it preposterous as an argument. I think what Pakistan was able to do was look at things that it could offer to the United States at a strategic and at a tactical level that the president truly cared about, starting with the Abbey Gate operation, and then say, look, we're open to doing business. And again, on that business, critical minerals was a key point, but critical minerals had been moving forward for a number of months prior to the new administration coming in. And the example of that is under General Bajwa, when he was army chief and Imran Khan was the prime minister. Rico Dick case was resolved with Barrick Mining, which was a Canadian company.
Mm-hmm.
So movement had already started, and the Pakistanis were signaling that they were open to having the West and the United States in particular participate in economic projects in Balochistan. And the biggest case in point of that during the Biden administration, in fact, was that the then US ambassador to Pakistan, Ambassador Bloom, went to Gwadar and talked about economic cooperation in Balochistan and in Gwadar publicly. And I think the Pakistanis were willing to walk that talk that they had about being open. And the Trump administration, they found a partner who wanted to say, okay, let's see how far this goes.
Right. So let's take it into, you've talked about the US Pakistan relationship, and you're basically arguing that there are things that Pakistan has that it can offer the Trump administration and has offered the Trump administration. But you're also pointing out that this also has implications for India, this new US Pakistan relationship. You're also arguing in some of your pieces that the United States now has an established interest in making sure that the United States and that India and Pakistan are talking to each other and resolve some of their tensions and differences. This has been something that India has been very opposed to, has pushed back on in several cases, has injected a great deal of tension into the US India relationship. Can you talk about that? Why exactly is it in America's interest to, after decades of pushing for talks between India and Pakistan, to try doing it again?
Well, see, the conversation that I've been able to gather about how this administration and those close to the president see this situation is that the United States needs support, cooperation, collaboration with both India and Pakistan on a variety of things. On the geopolitical side, the United States wants India to look into the Indian Ocean region and in the Indo Pacific to build its maritime capabilities and act as a hedge against China. On the manufacturing, cutting edge technology, and supply chain side, get reforms in India going so that alternative supply chains on everything, including semiconductors, can be looked at. Consistent bipartisan approach over there. And the calculus with this administration is that any sort of standoff between India and Pakistan at the line of control distracts from that goal. And that is not in American interest to have India sort of locked in the Himalayas, both on the line of control as well as the line of actual control. And so the United States wants India to figure things out with Pakistan because it frees up the standoff, so to speak, on the line of control. On the Pakistani side, yeah.
No, please. But my question to you was: do you think America will actually seriously push India or invest any diplomatic capital and risk its relationship with India to push it to have talks with Pakistan?
I mean, I would say that over the last few weeks, the President himself, Donald Trump, has talked about this unendingly, right? Just 48 hours or so ago, he talked about stopping the war between India and Pakistan once more. And on Monday in Sharm el Sheikh a few days ago, he talked about the fact that both India and Pakistan should behave and talk to each other. So I think the President is committed to that. And it's not just him. There's a reason why Secretary of State Marco Rubio, at the end of the announcement of the ceasefire tweet that he put out, talked about conversations between India and Pakistan as well. So I think because it's in this administration believes, again, from my conversations with folks close to this administration, that it is in American interest to get these two sides to talk and figure a pathway out towards a more normal relationship. That does not mean America is going to invest a lot of diplomatic effort to resolve Kashmir. But what America wants to see happen is a process of conversation on a whole host of issues between these two nuclear armed countries. And the logic, as I've gathered from these conversations, is as follows. If the United States and the President of the United States is willing to make Netanyahu and Hamas talk, he's willing to sit down and talk with Vladimir Putin, he himself is willing to sit down and talk to Xi Jinping, then he expects that his partners, both India and Pakistan, will also sit down and figure things out because he wants to focus attention on things that the United States wants from both these countries.
Right. But Mr. Yunus, if I could push you a little bit on that and say that one of the big sticking points in India Pakistan talks more generally has been the issue of Kashmir. I've had conversations with State Department officials, perhaps just as recently as the end of September, and they said that, look, we are not interested in pushing India and Pakistan to talk about Kashmir. But one of the key breaking points of the India Pakistan relationship, especially after 2019, was the fact that Pakistan said that we want an accommodation on Kashmir, and they have been opposed to what the Modi government did in 2019 with Article 370. Now, if the Modi government says that, look, this is an internal issue, we refuse to discuss it with Pakistan, it isn't on the table, then do you think a Pakistani government will come to the table and say we can have a broader ranging conversation without Kashmir on the table necessarily? Because, as I said, the Modi government seems opposed to it. And as I said with my conversations, the State Department doesn't seem interested in pushing. Is a conversation between India and Pakistan possible without Kashmir on the table?
Well, so first of all, on the State Department side, I would also say, as you know better than I do, because you talk to these people, this is a very different administration. The traditional administrative state and the ways in which the processes and protocols have worked in this administrative state historically in the United States on foreign policy are inactive and irrelevant. So one must be very cautious about what the bureaucracy and the administrative state wants in America at this point in time, and their ability to get those things done, or whether they in fact represent the views of the administration as well. That has been in evidence across a whole host of foreign policy issues outside of South Asia. I think as far as the Pakistani perspective on this is concerned, this is the problem. I think both sides right now are locked in a place where they're unable to bridge that gap. From the Pakistani side, the view is that everything, including Kashmir and, by the way, terrorism, should be on the table. But terrorism cannot just be about what India wants to talk about when it comes to terrorism. It should also be about what Pakistan believes is Indian sponsored terrorism in Pakistan. Now, that's their claim, right? India says, no, we won't talk about anything related to Kashmir, and also nothing related to what claim, the Pakistanis claim is Indian sponsored terror activity. It will only be about what we perceive as terrorism. And that's the standoff. And that's where we're stuck. But I think from this administration's perspective, having at least a starting point of a back channel is important. It is a priority. And whether the administrative state at the State Department wants it or not, it accepts it or not as being plausible, I don't think matters, because this president and his inner circle operate in a way in which they have not only disregard, but to be blunt, disdain for the administrative state and the levers of the administrative state in Washington, D.C.
Oh, that much we agree. But I specifically took the word of that State Department official carefully, because if this is someone who's very close to Marco Rubio, someone who's also very close to the MAGA movement more generally, not it is a political appointee who is speaking of this from the MAGA administration, which is precisely why the precise phraseology used by this diplomat was that President Trump has enough crises on his hands. He does not want to take on this one as well. But, it's an interesting question that you raise about terrorism. I just want to wrap up with this question on the possibility of India-Pakistan talks, precisely because we saw in 2009 this massive upsurge of public opinion when the Indian government, after 26/11, went forward and said that, look, when even included in, I think, the Sharm el Sheikh declaration, the mention of possible discussions on Balochistan, there was a massive public upsurge against that in India. There has been a clear sense that the Indian public opinion is against discussing this. And of course, discussing it or putting it on the table will give credibility and legitimacy to a claim that India does not fundamentally recognize. Are those fundamentally breaking points? And the question I'm asking you again is, will the American administration put in that kind of investment to ensure that India and Pakistan will talk about something that India does not legitimately acknowledge as something that is happening, which is what's happening in Balochistan?
I think the president himself would like for that conversation to happen, and if that conversation were to happen, he would look kindly upon the leadership both in New Delhi and in Islamabad for talking to each other and encourage that process. Having said that, it's not that the president is going to say, you shall talk tomorrow or I will put 300% tariffs on you. I don't think he's going to exercise that kind of leverage. So beyond the fact that it buys you brownie points and buys you an opening to talk to the president of saying, you are endorsing this process and therefore we're going to initiate this and see where this goes, I don't think beyond that he will invest that much effort. However, it will continue to strain the relationship between both countries, India and the United States, and India and Pakistan, if either actor is seen as being or seen as conducting actions that undermine the push that the president has, which is talk to each other, right? And so one must be careful about that perspective as well. Now, at the end of the day, when whether one acknowledges something or not, and things are stuck, whether the public would react a certain way in New Delhi or in Islamabad, Lahore, or Karachi, I think that's the fundamental problem right now between both countries right now, that they have become hostage to the narratives that they have created and fed to their own people, such that the narrative itself is big now driving policy. And the art of statesmanship, as I have studied in diplomacy, is to make sure that one communicates to one's people why certain decisions have to be made in the larger interest, even if they may seem unpalatable. And I think the problem in South Asia and India and Pakistan particularly is that the media ecosystem that has been created over the years for domestic political agenda has now become sort of so powerful on its own that it has boxed policymakers into something that perhaps if you ask them privately, they would say, yes, it's a problem, and we don't know how to navigate it. But now foreign policy is stuck as a result of this issue.
Right. Mr. Yunus, could I ask you about something that you mentioned and I would like to focus on, which is what you've already pointed out, that the improvement of the relationship between the United States and Pakistan has already led to significant questions in New Delhi, significant anger in the public, also perhaps because of media narratives, but also because of a genuine sense that um, a improved relationship between the United States and Pakistan harkens back to memories of what happened in the 1980s and 1990s that were very detrimental in terms of the US-Pakistan relationship for India. But you've made the argument that over the last couple of years, the US foreign policy in South Asia was very much focused on the idea that America would defer to India's interest and judgment in South Asia and would not try to push its own interests. But the improvement of the relationship with Pakistan means that that era of deference to India's interests is over, and that could cause tensions between India and the United States. Could you explain that argument?
Yeah, so I think the point here that I've made in that essay, right, is that the United States, post Afghanistan or the tail end of the Afghanistan endeavor, sort of realized that it was playing a much larger, more strategic embrace, part of a much larger and strategic embrace with India. And therefore, to build trust, if that meant downsizing the relationship with Pakistan, even where there were alignment of interests, was good because the long game was bring India closer. This administration's view is that it needs certain things with bilateral partners and will treat those relationships on a bilateral basis and no longer defer to or play those long games that 30 years later something good might happen as a payoff. And in the immediate term, the administration's calculus is that when it comes to critical minerals and the emerging security architecture in the Middle East, Pakistan has a lot of things to offer, and therefore the administration will come close to it. That does not mean that Pakistan's relationship with the United States will be anywhere near as strategic as the relationship with India. But India must be comfortable with Uncle Sam having its own relations and its own investments in Pakistan and not feel insecure about it. Now, of course, that's causing a lot of heartburn in New Delhi as we speak. But I think the message from Washington and the Trump inner circle consistently has been that India is a much more valued partner. And in fact, it also has a lot to contribute to America's grand strategy. It cannot expect a hyphenation, which is the interesting part to me here, a hyphenation between the India US relationship and the India or the Pakistan US relationship as well, which is interesting because when you talk to Pakistani interlocutors, their view is look at the Pakistan US relationship on its own merits and demerits, and look at the India US relationship on its own merits and demerits. Don't downsize one because of your views of the other. And what New Delhi, after 30 plus years of arguing, which was do not hyphenate India and Pakistan, now seems to be doing is saying we hyphenate India and Pakistan, and anything that is seen as coming closer to Pakistan will be seen as at the expense of India, which is a very interesting evolution of India's foreign policy as far as I see it.
Right. But do you think that this is a trend that will stick in the long term? Many people have argued that, look, this is the Trump administration. It is very unique to how Trump sees Shehbaz Sharif and Asim Munir, because more specifically, I think that there was an argument that I think Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell, Biden's Deputy Secretary of State, just said in a very recent article for Foreign Affairs. He said, and I'm quoting from him here, in practical terms, the next time a South Asian country faces challenges, the United States would defer to India's judgment on what might serve regional stability or counter China's influence rather than seek to advance its own preference. So the argument, of course, Kurt Campbell was a very senior diplomat until very recently for the Democrats was saying is that actually, no, we need to move in this direction where we have a bunch of deputy sheriffs across the world. India is our country in South Asia, and we will defer to their interests. So is this the view that if the Republicans and Trump move on and the Democrats then come in, that this view that we must defer to India in South Asia because we just don't fundamentally want to do as much in the world. India is our number two in South Asia. Will that view take hold again? And then again, the US Pakistan relationship fades into what it used to be under the Biden administration.
It might, and I think that that perspective on the left may continue, but in the near term, some things might also erode that possibility from happening. Key among them being that if India were to be the sheriff, to use your words, in the Indian Ocean region or in South Asia, then in many ways, Pakistan in the next 3 years may likely emerge as the sheriff in the Arabian Peninsula and in partnership with Saudi Arabia and in places like Gaza, Syria, etc. as well. So the United States will also then have to think about, under a Democrat administration, about the fact that in the CENTCOM area of operations, Pakistan is part of that sheriff architecture that helps stabilize the region and provide security or be a net security provider in the Middle Eastern region as well. So I think in the near term, those kinds of calculus and calculations and evolution of strategy will change some of the things that are now expected to come back in the next time the Democrats are in power, for example. So I think one must be careful about the sort of consistency of that view. And I think that's what the Pakistanis are also trying to bank on, right, is to firmly cement themselves in CENTCOM's area of operations and in the Saudi camp. And through the Saudi camp, there are certain security realities that will set in with or without sort of a role in Gaza. And I think that's what they're aiming for over the next few years.
Right. Mr. Yunus, could I ask you a couple of final questions? You talked about America trying to integrate Pakistan much more into its new security architecture in the Middle East, working much more closely with Saudi Arabia. We saw the Saudi-Pakistan Defense Pact. Do you think that as part of this, we will see America make fresh defense sales to the Pakistani military, something that has been immensely controversial in India?
I don't think there will be any major strategic sales made to Pakistan. I think the sales that you might see would be limited in terms of technical and military support for existing platforms Pakistan has. Beyond that, I do not expect any next generation sales of platforms to happen. And in fact, the Pakistanis, from their own perspective in terms of military investments and capabilities, are firmly aligned with next generation Chinese platforms, as well as next generation Turkish platforms, along in their partnership with Azerbaijan as well. So I do not see anything like that happening anytime soon. What is likely to happen, however, is that as the Saudi Pakistan partnership moves forward, Saudi Arabia has access to next generation American platforms. And through that relationship, Pakistani pilots, Pakistani military officers, etc., will get to try their hands on next generation American platforms, as they have previously in the historical, and that might cause some level of concern in New Delhi, and rightfully so, because access to those technologies would inform Pakistan's own assessment of what these platforms are capable of. And if and when India gets access to those as well, then of course there is some level of familiarity that the Pakistanis would have, in many ways similar to, as you would know, they would establish with the Rafale jets back in the day when they were working with the Qataris on some of these
Mhm.
platforms.
Right. Could I also ask you in terms of what Pakistan and the United States are going to work on moving forward? There's, as you mentioned right at the beginning, there's that history that continues. I mean, I've been in Washington for about 4.5 months, so not a very long period of time as compared to you. But when I talked to folks in the Pentagon and the War Department, there's very much the sense of remembering what happened in the Afghanistan war. It continues to embitter, in some senses, the US-Pakistan relationship on the strategic side. There are many people in this town who feel that Pakistan, as a strategic partner, is not to be trusted. How does that play moving forward? The legacy and the history of what happened in Afghanistan and Pakistan's support, let's say tacitly, for the Taliban. How does that play out as America wants to integrate Pakistan into playing a greater role in the Middle East when it remembers what happened in Afghanistan?
So I think that legacy is perhaps the greatest headwind Pakistan still faces in terms of the next chapter of its relationship with the United States, and that will take some time. And that's where demonstrating success on a new set of priorities is going to be important. Key among them being operationalizing the critical mineral investments, as well as operationalizing collectively the roadmap for a new Middle Eastern security architecture, which is well on the way. If Pakistan falters on those two things, it will find itself facing even greater headwinds in this relationship, because they will compound the historical legacy issues that you've talked about. And so I think Pakistani policymakers are very aware of that limitation and that headwind that they face. Having said that, the United States' political system also goes through these cyclical evolutions. So the war on terror is firmly over. As far as America's political class is concerned, it's not a talking point anymore. So as we go through the political cycles, those memories will also fade, and so things will get better if Pakistan starts delivering. Now, if Pakistan falters again, of course, everything is up for grabs, and that will add volatility to the relationship. The last thing I would add on this as well is that there are still also a lot of people in this town and in the sort of um, retired community that also want to do something about the Taliban problem as well. And over the last few months, Pakistan has started taking on the Taliban problem much more aggressively in ways that certain people in the political system, both on the left and on the right, would want Pakistan to do. So that opens up a new door as well, potentially. I'm not saying it's a full on open door, but it opens up a new door to sort of say there are old scores to be settled here with the Talibs ruling Kabul. And if Pakistan can play a role in helping settle those old scores, then perhaps some of that baggage will also go away as a result of that.
Right. And something you said I thought was very interesting. You said that, Pakistan has to deliver on the promises that it's made to the Trump administration. And one of the key and very interesting things that you are talking about is this role that America wants Pakistan to play in the Middle East. You've also written, I think, very interestingly about Pakistan's domestic problems, its economic problems at this point in time, the reforms that have yet to be made. Does Pakistan have the economic capacity to handle a sort of deputy sheriff role along with Saudi Arabia in terms of helping guard all of West Asia and also handling its security challenges with India?
Well, it does. And the reason for that answer is that the deputy sheriff role in West Asia or the Middle East is classic case of Pakistan's ability over 75 years to what I call extract geopolitical rents. Pakistan managed to do that through the Sito-Cento partnerships decades ago. It managed to do that through the Afghan jihad era, where the United States and Saudi Arabia supported it deeply, and then post 9/11 through CSF and other economic flows as well. So, if Pakistan plays a role in the new architecture of the Middle East, of course, there will be payoffs and investments and other financial flows linked to that will help cover the cost and then some of Pakistani support in those places. So, that's actually what the Pakistanis want. They want an ability to demonstrate their capacity and in that process get access to financing and economic investment that they need. Now the challenge for Pakistan, which has been a challenge for the last 30 plus years, is that extraction of those geopolitical rents without sustainable economic reforms will only lead to long-term problems down the road when the rents go away. And the challenge that they're trying to navigate now is how do we go from new geopolitical rents through investments in new capacity, whether on the critical mineral side, whether on the power sector side, whether on the technology side, such that economic capacity writ large grows. And on that, a lot of work is being done to operationalize the critical minerals vision. And the hope there is that that unlocks a lot of next wave of investments. But we're very early on in this process. So far, it's just the Reko Diq mine, the ADB, the IFC, potentially the DFC may start financing the projects as well around it, and then the Saudis may enter, but there's a long way to go. And again, the credibility gap that Pakistan has is very real. Therefore, it's on the ball is in their court to deliver on that. And if they fail, the geopolitical rents will come, but they will go away in the next 5, 7, 8 years at most. And then we'll be back to square one in terms of the conversation on Pakistan and its lack of reform. And that's the trick that the Pakistani policymakers have to figure out if they are to sustainably get out of this cycle of economic dependency and economic crisis.
Right. So, Mr. Yunus, two final questions then. I'll promise to be brief with them. The first is, of course, on China, which is that China has maintained a great deal of military, defense, economic support for Pakistan. Much of Pakistan's military gets its equipment from China. You've talked about that improving relationship between the United States and America. You've talked about America wanting Pakistan to play a greater role in West Asia. But do you see the relationship with China and the fact that if Pakistan's military is going to play that role in West Asia that America wants it to play, will America be comfortable with Pakistan doing it with Chinese weapons, Chinese equipment, and a deep strategic partnership with China?
I think that's going to be a tricky challenge to navigate, and the reason for that is that there is distrust and sort of competition in the US China relationship that is outside of Pakistan's control. So, if that competition sharpens and continues to go down the path as it has over the last few years, Pakistan will find itself sort of caught in the middle. The Pakistani argument to the United States and to China both has been that West Asia and Balochistan need not become an area of strategic divergence, but in fact, they are areas of strategic convergence for both countries because a more stable Balochistan means that where Canada, the United States, Europe, and China all invest on mining and mineral assets makes Chinese projects economically viable. and it also provides the United States access to alternative streams of critical minerals as well. So it's a win-win. On the Middle East, it's the same thing, that if the Pakistanis can help play a more positive role in stabilizing the Middle East, then the flow of energy, of which China is the largest buyer, is much more stable. It doesn't get expensive or is held hostage to the Houthis or whatever else might stop the flow of tankers. And so it's a good outcome for China. And on the Pakistani side, if the Pakistanis are playing that role, then lower energy prices are good for Pakistan. And oh, by the way, the rents that are extracted out of that, and the Pakistani economy, if it does well as a result of those investment flows, it will buy Chinese manufacturing output, Chinese solar panels, Chinese batteries, and oh, by the way, Chinese defense platforms as well. So the strategy on the Pakistani side is that there are win-win outcomes here. And the foreign policy goal, or the grand strategy goal, is to ensure that Western Pakistan itself and its sort of immediate area of operations in the West Asian region becomes an arena for strategic convergence, not divergence between the US and China. So far, it seems that it's working out that way and they're balancing it. But again, if the US China relationship goes completely off the rails, then it's a problem for Pakistan, and they're very well aware of that.
Right. Mr. Yunus, my final question is something that you've talked about a lot, is the prospects of reform in Pakistan. One of the major reasons why General Bajwa, who was the previous army chief, pursued a ceasefire with India on the line of control and pursued a policy of even calling for economic cooperation with India, was because he recognized that internal reform, growing Pakistan's economy, that was really key for Pakistan going forward. Are you confident that the leadership team that is currently present with Asim Munir, Shehbaz Sharif, with Imran Khan in jail, that the present leadership of Pakistan understands it and has the wherewithal to carry out the reforms that they need?
Most definitely do, and I think in the last few months it's become even more clear to them that economic reform and sort of fixing the political economy constraints of the Pakistani system are priority number one, two, and three. And it is for that reason that I would say, not only, as you rightfully said, that General Bajwa went towards that ceasefire with India at a time, by the way, when India was standing off with the Chinese on the line of actual control, but that General Munir and Field Marshal Munir, both in those roles, have continued and held up that ceasefire. So as we speak, despite all that has happened this year, the ceasefire is holding firm, and that is good. And the Pakistanis want that to happen. And from the perspective of Pakistan's elite, both military as well as political elite, the focus is internal. And the focus is one that reduces tensions in the region, allows Pakistan to reform its own political economy, and more importantly, also allow it to look westwards on the challenge coming out from Afghanistan. As you may have already seen over the last few days, a lot of clashes with the Taliban. That is the more immediate and pressing threat. And it is for this reason that the ceasefire holds. And it is for this reason that the Pakistanis have continued to try to find a way to engage in a dialogue with India.
Right. I'm sorry. I promised that the last question would be the last question, but I have to ask another one. I have to abuse the fact that you're giving me so much of your time, which is this question of terrorism, which is that India has raised this considerably. You've talked about the fact that both sides need stability to do other things. India needs stability to focus on the competition with China on the seas and not being focused on the land, on its land borders at all times. Pakistan needs peace in order to ensure that it can reform its economy. My question to you is, after what we've seen this year with Operation Sindoor, with India accusing Pakistan of carrying out the Pahalgam terrorist attacks, are you convinced that the Pakistani military will stick to that policy? Because we've seen Khwaja Asif come here, the Pakistani defense minister. He admitted that, look, we have had links with terrorist groups in the past. That is a policy that we intend to be in the past. But then, of course, you also had what India is saying is happening in the Pahalgam terrorist attacks. There is also this broader sense in India that you hear a lot, and sort of many US scholars have also talked about it, that the Pakistani military, of course, maintains its control over Pakistan's politics because of the fact that a managed level of competition with India, terrorist attacks, military confrontation, helps its domestic popularity, helps it maintain control over Pakistan's resources. Will we see moving forward a change in that policy if Pakistan really wants to reform?
I think by and large, the Pakistanis are committed to a policy of dealing with terrorism and terror proxies on its own soil. And many private conversations They acknowledge that these groups are essentially franchises. They're almost like the Premier League franchise system of terror groups, that you are part of one today and another tomorrow, and you go around the circuit, so to speak. Having said that, there's also the view in Pakistan as well that terrorism is not a one-way street anymore. That prior to Pahalgam, there was Jafar Express, something that was, from the Pakistani perspective, celebrated across Indian media and India right-wing ecosystem as something that was amazing, that had been done to show the Pakistanis what India can do. That's what the Pakistanis claim as well, right? And I think the challenge here now, moving forward, for political leaders on both sides, is to figure out a pathway to talk to each other, to sort of escalate from here on out, agree to a set of new rules of the road, and figure out what is acceptable and not acceptable in what both sides now claim are proxy wars being fought on their soil. And so long as leaders don't acknowledge the need for dialogue, I think this will continue to be something that will keep bringing both these nuclear armed countries to the brink of nuclear conflict, which is not good for the world. And I think it will distract them from things that they need to do on their own sides, in their own countries, from priorities to deliver on the human development, economic needs of their own people. And so I think the challenge now is one of leadership and statesmanship. And I think leadership and statesmanship, unfortunately, in all over the world right now, is in scarce supply, kind of probably as scarce as clean air is in the Punjab heartland across India and Pakistan these days.
And that's especially true now with Diwali approaching in India. Mr. Yunus, thank you so much for your time. Principal at the Asia Group, a perceptive analyst of South Asia and, of course, of the US Pakistan relationship. Thank you so much for joining us here on the HD podcast.
Thank you.